marble floor stretched endlessly beneath the soft glow of chandeliers, their light reflecting off gold that had witnessed centuries of whispered decisions. The walls stood silent, yet they seemed to remember everything, every ambition, every secret, every moment that could never be undone. In these vast halls, power once moved quietly, dressed in silk and certainty, believing it would last forever, but, eventually, something felt unsettled. Behind the polished mirrors and painted ceilings lingered a quiet weight of choices made too late, of lives shaped by duty rather than desire, of a future slipping away before anyone dared to admit it. The deeper one walked into these corridors, the more the grandeur began to feel like a disguise, carefully hiding cracks that had already begun to spread. This was not just a palace, it was a witness to an empire that had mastered power, without war, that had bound nations together through marriage and strategy, and that had ruled Europe from the heart of Vienna. Yet, within these very rooms of Schönbrunn Palace, the Habsburg Empire carried the seeds of its own unraveling long before the world ever saw it fall. Long before their name echoed through the grand courts of Europe, the Habsburgs began as modest nobles in a rugged corner of what is now modern-day Switzerland. Their story did not begin with crowns or empires, but with stone walls, uncertain alliances, and the constant need to survive among rival lords who were just as ambitious and far less patient. Around the early 11th century, a figure known as Count Radbot of Kletko laid the foundation of what would become one of the most powerful dynasties in European history. He constructed a fortress known as Habsburg Castle, perched high above the Ari River. It was not built as a symbol of greatness, but as a necessity protection against enemies, a statement of presence in a fragmented and volatile region. From this stronghold, the family took its name, though at the time, it carried little weight beyond local influence. The early Habsburgs were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They did not possess vast armies or unmatched wealth. Instead, they relied on patience, calculation, and an acute understanding of political opportunity. In a world where brute force often dictated outcomes, the Habsburgs quietly observed, waited, and positioned themselves where advantage could be gained without unnecessary risk. Their true ascent began in the 13th century, when Rudolf of Habsburg emerged as a figure of unexpected importance. In 1273, he was elected King of the Romans, a title that placed him at the center of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a remarkable achievement for a family that, until then, had been considered relatively minor among Europe's noble houses. Rudolf's reign marked a decisive turning point, not because he conquered vast lands overnight, but because he secured legitimacy through strategic decisions and calculated alliances. Rudolf expanded Habsburg influence into Austria, a region that would become the heart of their power for centuries to come. It was here that the family began to transform from regional nobles into rulers with lasting authority. Yet even in this early rise, there was a subtle shift taking place. Power was no longer something to seize quickly. It was something to build, carefully, to protect, and to pass down. This approach would define the Habsburgs for generations. But it also carried an unseen cost, one that would only reveal itself much later, when the weight of preserving power became heavier than the power itself. If the early Habsburgs had relied on patience to survive, their next generation would rely on something far more powerful, while other dynasties sharpened swords and prepared for war. The Habsburgs began to shape a different kind of strategy, one that would quietly redraw the map of Europe without the need for constant bloodshed. By the 15th century, this approach had found its most effective architect in Maximilian. The firstborn in 1459, Maximilian inherited not only ambition but also a clear understanding of his family's strengths. He knew the Habsburgs could not outfight every rival, but they could outmaneuver them. And so, he turned to alliances sealed not on battlefields, but at wedding altars. In 1477, Maximilian married Mary of Burgundy, one of the wealthiest heiresses in Europe. It was a union that transformed the fortunes of the Habsburg family almost overnight. Through this marriage, they gained control over the prosperous Burgundian territories, including parts of modern Belgium and the Netherlands. Wealth flowed in influence expanded, and the family's presence in European politics became impossible to ignore. But Maximilian did not stop there. He understood that one successful marriage could open the door to many more. His son, Philip later, known as Philip the Handsome, was married to Joanna of Castile, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. This single decision would have consequences far beyond what anyone at the time could fully grasp. Through Joanna, the Habsburgs gained a claim to the Spanish throne, along with its vast overseas territories. Within a single generation, the family's reach extended across Austria, Burgundy, Spain, and beyond. It was an expansion unlike anything Europe had seen, not through conquest, but through connection. The phrase often associated with the dynasty captured it perfectly. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It was both a strategy and a philosophy, one that elevated the Habsburgs into a position of unmatched influence. Yet beneath this success lay a growing complexity. These marriages bound together lands that differed in language, culture, and identity. What appeared to be unity was, in reality, a delicate balance that required constant maintenance. Each new alliance brought not only opportunity, but also expectation duties that extended beyond borders and generations. For the Habsburgs, power was no longer local or even regional. It had become continental, but as their influence expanded, so too did the challenge of holding it together. The very strategy that brought them greatness began to weave a web that would one day prove difficult to control. Asterisk. By the early 16th century, the Habsburg dynasty had transformed from a strategic noble house into a force that dominated the political landscape of Europe. At the center of this transformation stood Charles V, a ruler whose inheritance alone seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Through a chain of carefully arranged marriages and fortunate successions, Charles came to control a vast collection of territories that stretched across continents. When Charles was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, he already ruled Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and Austria. With the addition of the imperial crown, his authority extended even further across the fragmented lands of the Holy Roman Empire. It was said that, in his realm, the sun never set a reflection not only of geographical reach, but of an influence that touched nearly every corner of European politics. Yet ruling such an empire was far from simple. Each territory had its own customs, laws, and expectations, and maintaining unity required constant attention. Charles spent much of his reign traveling between regions, attempting to hold together a political structure that had grown vast beyond precedent. While the Habsburg strategy of expansion through marriage had brought immense success, it had also created a system that depended heavily on personal authority to function. At the same time, external threats continued to challenge Habsburg dominance. One of the most pressing dangers came from the Ottoman Empire, which had been steadily advancing into Europe. In 1529, the Ottomans laid siege to Vienna, the heart of Habsburg power. Although the city ultimately withstood the attack, the event revealed how vulnerable even the strongest empire could be. The Habsburgs were no longer simply expanding, they were defending a position that demanded constant vigilance. Internal conflict proved equally difficult. The Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther in 1517, began to spread rapidly across Europe, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church and, by extension, the rulers who supported it. Charles V, a devout Catholic, found himself in direct opposition to many of his own subjects. The empire became divided not only by geography, but by belief. Efforts to restore unity through negotiation and force met with limited success, and tensions continued to grow. These overlapping pressures, religious division, external threats, and the sheer scale of governance placed an enormous strain on Charles and the system he represented. Despite his power, he faced the reality that no single ruler could effectively manage such a vast and diverse empire indefinitely. The structure that had once been the source of Habsburg strength was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. In 1556, Charles made a decision that would shape the future of the dynasty. He chose to divide his holdings, separating the empire into two main branches, The Spanish territories passed to his son, Philip II, while the Austrian lands and the imperial title were given to his brother, Ferdinand I. This division was practical, designed to make governance more manageable, but it also marked the end of a unified Habsburg Empire at its peak. Even so, the family remained deeply influential across Europe. Both branches continued to play major roles in politics, religion, and warfare. The Habsburg name carried authority, and their presence in royal courts remained strong. However, the split introduced a subtle shift. What had once been a single, dominant force became two related but distinct powers, each facing its own challenges and priorities. Despite these changes, the image of Habsburg dominance endured. They had reached a level of influence that few families in history could rival. Their control over key regions, their ability to shape alliances, and their deep connections across royal houses ensured that they remained at the center of European affairs. Yet beneath this outward strength, the foundations had begun to change. The need to divide power, the rise of internal conflict, and the increasing difficulty of maintaining unity all pointed to a deeper issue. The empire had grown so large, so complex, that its stability could no longer be taken for granted. What once appeared unbreakable was, in reality, beginning to shift. Asterisk, as the Habsburgs secured their place at the center of European power, their dominance did not go unnoticed. Across the continent, another force was rising, one that would challenge not only their authority, but their very claim to supremacy. This was not a sudden clash, but a slow and inevitable collision between two visions of control, each unwilling to yield. The rivalry between the Habsburgs and the French monarchy, particularly the Bourbon dynasty, began as a contest of influence rather than open hostility. Both powers sought to shape the political future of Europe, and both understood that there could be little room for equal dominance. Where the Habsburgs relied on strategic marriages and inherited alliances, France pursued centralized strength, military power, and a growing sense of national identity. Tensions first became clear during the Italian wars in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. These conflicts were not merely about territory, but about prestige and positioning. Control over Italy meant access to wealth, culture, and influence, and neither side was willing to step back. Charles V, representing Habsburg authority, found himself in direct opposition to Francis I of France. Their encounters were marked by competition that was as personal as it was political. The Battle of Pavia in 1525 became one of the defining moments of this early conflict. Francis I was captured by Habsburg forces, an event that should have secured a decisive advantage. Yet even in defeat, the rivalry did not end. Instead, it deepened. Francis, once released, continued to oppose Habsburg expansion, determined to prevent Europe from falling under a single dominant power. What made this rivalry particularly significant was not just the scale of the conflict, but its persistence. It extended beyond individual rulers and became embedded within the identities of both dynasties. Each generation inherited not only lands and titles, but also a sense of opposition that shaped their decisions and alliances. For the Habsburgs, this was a new kind of challenge. Their rise had been built on careful planning and calculated expansion, but now they faced a rival who refused to play by the same rules. France was not bound by the same reliance on marriage or tradition. It was bold, direct, and increasingly willing to confront Habsburg influence through force. Beneath the political maneuvering, a deeper shift was taking place. The Habsburgs, once masters of quiet expansion, were being drawn into a cycle of conflict that demanded constant response. Power was no longer something they could simply build, it was something they had to defend. Again and again in wheat confrontation, the cost of that defense began to grow. Asterisk. What began as a calculated rivalry soon expanded into a series of conflicts that would reshape the political and social fabric of Europe. The struggle between the Habsburgs and their rivals was no longer confined to isolated battles or diplomatic disputes. It evolved into a sustained period of tension, where alliances shifted, loyalties fractured, and entire regions were drawn into cycles of instability. By the early 17th century, these pressures reached a breaking point in what would become one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, the 30 Years' War. Beginning in 1618, the war was sparked by religious tensions within the Holy Roman Empire, but it quickly grew into a broader struggle involving many of Europe's major powers. At its core, it was a conflict between Catholic and Protestant states, yet political ambition ensured that its scope extended far beyond religion alone. For the Habsburgs, the war represented both a defense of their authority and a test of their ability to maintain control over a deeply divided empire. As staunch defenders of Catholicism, they sought to restore religious unity within their territories. However, this objective placed them in direct opposition to Protestant princes and external powers who feared the consolidation of Habsburg dominance. The conflict spread rapidly across Central Europe, leaving destruction in its wake. Cities were devastated, populations declined, and entire regions faced economic collapse. What had begun as a dispute over faith became a prolonged struggle for survival. The Habsburgs, despite their strength, found themselves stretched across multiple fronts, forced to confront not only internal rebellion but also foreign intervention from powers such as Sweden and France. France's involvement was particularly significant. Although a Catholic nation, it chose to support Protestant forces in order to weaken Habsburg influence. This decision revealed the true nature of the rivalry. Politics had overtaken religion as the driving force. The balance of power in Europe mattered more than shared belief, and France was determined to prevent the Habsburgs from achieving uncontested dominance. As the war dragged on, the costs became increasingly apparent. For the Habsburgs, maintaining control required continuous effort, resources, and sacrifice. Victory was no longer defined by expansion, but by the ability to endure. The prolonged conflict exposed the limits of their power, highlighting the difficulty of governing a vast and divided empire under constant pressure. When the war finally ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, the outcome marked a turning point. While the Habsburgs remained influential, their authority within the Holy Roman Empire was significantly reduced. The agreement recognized the sovereignty of individual states, weakening central control and reshaping the political structure of Europe. Beyond the political consequences, the war left a lasting impact on the identity of the Habsburgs. They were no longer simply a dynasty of expansion and strategy. They had become rulers, defined by conflict, forced to navigate a world where power was increasingly contested and fragile. The tension had not only reached Europe, it had begun to reshape them. In the years following the 30 Years' War, the nature of power in Europe began to shift in ways the Habsburgs could not fully control. While they remained one of the most influential dynasties on the continent, their authority was no longer unquestioned. A new kind of competition emerged, one that was not fought solely on battlefields, but within courts, culture, and public perception. At the center of this transformation stood France, led by Louis XIV, a ruler who understood that power could be displayed as much as it could be enforced. His court at Versailles became a symbol of absolute monarchy, where every detail, from architecture to etiquette, was designed to reinforce his supremacy. Nobles were drawn into a world where loyalty was measured not just by service, but by presence, appearance, and submission to a carefully constructed image of control. For the Habsburgs, this posed a unique challenge. Their strength had always rested on tradition, legitimacy, and the deep-rooted authority of their dynasty. Vienna remained a center of power, but it lacked the theatrical dominance that Versailles projected so effectively. The Habsburg court was formal, structured, and deeply tied to religious identity. Yet it struggled to compete with the cultural magnetism that France began to command. This was not simply a matter of style. It was a battle for recognition of who truly defined power in Europe. Diplomacy became increasingly influenced by perception. Alliances were shaped not only by strategic necessity, but by which court appeared more stable, more modern, and more capable of leading the continent into the future. In response, the Habsburgs reinforced their own traditions. They emphasized ceremony, hierarchy, and the continuity of their rule. Schönbrunn Palace, along with other imperial residences, became a symbol of their enduring presence. Its grand halls and carefully designed gardens reflected a dynasty that still believed in its central role in European affairs. Yet beneath this display, there was a growing awareness that the world was changing in ways they could not easily control. The pressure to maintain status extended beyond politics and into the personal lives of the Habsburg family. Marriages continued to serve as tools of alliance, but they also became sources of strain. Expectations were rigid, choices were limited, and individual desires were often set aside in favor of duty. Members of the dynasty were raised to uphold an image of perfection, even as their private lives became increasingly constrained. Over time, this created a quiet but persistent tension. The same system that had once secured the family's rise now imposed limitations that were difficult to escape. Identity became tied not to personal ambition, but to the preservation of a legacy that demanded constant reinforcement. For some, this meant a life of privilege without freedom. For others, it led to a sense of isolation that could not be openly expressed. Publicly. The Habsburgs remained symbols of stability. Their influence continued to shape diplomacy, and their presence in European affairs was still significant. However, the gap between perception and reality began to widen. While the court maintained its image of strength, internal challenges grew more complex. The balance between tradition and adaptation became increasingly difficult to sustain. At the same time, the broader political landscape was evolving. Emerging powers and shifting alliances meant that dominance could no longer be assumed. The idea of absolute authority, once central to dynasties like the Habsburgs, was gradually being questioned. New ways of thinking about governance, identity, and national belonging began to take hold, setting the stage for future conflicts that would test the limits of old systems. For the Habsburgs, the battle for status was no longer just about maintaining influence. It was about proving relevance in a changing world. They continued to hold their position, but it required greater effort, greater control, and greater sacrifice than before. And with each passing generation, the weight of that expectation grew heavier, pressing against a dynasty that had once seemed unshakable. By the 19th century, the Habsburg Empire stood as a vast and complex structure, still impressive in appearance but increasingly difficult to sustain. What had once been a carefully managed system of alliances and authority was now strained by forces that could no longer be controlled through tradition alone. The world around the empire was changing, and the pace of that change was beginning to outstrip the dynasty's ability to adapt. At the center of this evolving landscape was Emperor Franz Joseph I, who came to power in 1848 during a period of widespread unrest across Europe. His reign began not with stability, but with revolution. Nationalist movements, driven by a growing sense of identity among different ethnic groups within the empire, challenged the very idea of a unified Habsburg rule. Hungarians, Czechs, and others sought greater autonomy, if not complete independence. Franz Joseph responded with a commitment to order and continuity. He believed deeply in the traditions that had sustained his family for centuries, and sought to preserve them in the face of mounting pressure. While this approach restored a degree of stability, it also reinforced a system that was becoming increasingly rigid. The empire held together, but only through careful management and constant compromise. Industrialization added another layer of complexity. Economic changes began to reshape society, creating new classes and expectations that did not fit within the old structures of imperial rule. Cities grew, ideas spread more rapidly, and the demand for political representation increased. The Habsburg system, built on hierarchy and inherited authority, struggled to respond to these developments in a way that satisfied its diverse population. Externally, the balance of power in Europe was shifting. The rise of Prussia and the eventual unification of Germany in 1871 introduced a new force that challenged Habsburg influence in Central Europe. Austria's defeat in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866 marked a significant loss of status, signaling that the empire could no longer dominate the region as it once had. In an attempt to stabilize internal divisions, the empire was restructured in 1867 into the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. This arrangement granted Hungary greater autonomy while maintaining the overall framework of Habsburg rule. It was a pragmatic solution, but also an acknowledgement that the empire could no longer function as a single, unified authority. Beneath these political adjustments, a deeper tension continued to build. Nationalism, economic change, and shifting alliances created an environment where even a minor spark could lead to significant consequences. The empire remained standing, but its foundations were no longer secure. What lay ahead was not a sudden collapse, but a moment that would bring all these pressures together, an event that would turn strain into rupture and uncertainty into irreversible action. Asterisk. The moment that would alter the course of the Habsburg Empire arrived not with a grand declaration of war, but with a single accident, violent and impossible to reverse. On 28 June 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, traveled through crowded streets under the watch of both officials and onlookers. It was meant to be a routine visit, a display of presence in a region already marked by tension. Yet beneath the surface, unrest had been quietly building. Bosnia and Herzegovina, recently annexed by the empire, had become a focal point of nationalist sentiment. Many within the region resisted Habsburg control, viewing it as an extension of foreign rule. Among these groups were individuals willing to act, not through negotiation, but through violence. Their aim was not simply protest, but disruption in an attempt to challenge an empire they believed had no rightful claim over them. As the Archduke's motorcade moved through Sarajevo, an initial attempt on his life failed. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the danger had passed. Plans were adjusted, routes reconsidered, and the visit continued. But in a turn of events that would later be seen as both chance and inevitability, the Archduke's car took a wrong turn, bringing it directly into the path of Gavrilo Princip, a young nationalist who had been waiting for another opportunity. What followed took only seconds. Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots, one striking Franz Ferdinand, the other his wife, Sophie. Both were fatally wounded. The streets that had moments before carried the rhythm of an ordinary day were suddenly transformed into the site of an event that would echo far beyond Sarajevo. The immediate reaction was one of shock, but within the halls of power, the assassination was quickly understood as more than an isolated act. It was seen as a direct challenge to imperial authority, a provocation that demanded response. Austria-Hungary, supported by its ally Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia, where the nationalist movement was believed to have connections. Diplomatic efforts followed, but they unfolded within an atmosphere already charged with suspicion and rivalry. Alliances that had been carefully constructed over decades began to activate, drawing multiple nations into the conflict. What might have remained a regional crisis expanded rapidly, as declarations of war spread across Europe. For the Habsburg Empire, this was not merely a response to an assassination. It was an assertion of strength, an attempt to reinforce control at a moment when authority appeared threatened. Yet in choosing confrontation, the empire set into motion a chain of events that could no longer be contained. The decision to act transformed a single incident into a global conflict. World War I had begun, and with it, the final chapter of Habsburg. Power was already taking shape, though few, if any, fully realized it at the time. The outbreak of war in 1914 was met with a sense of urgency and determination within the Habsburg Empire. What had begun as a response to a single act of violence quickly evolved into a prolonged and exhausting conflict that would test the limits of imperial power. At first, there was confidence that the war would be swift, that strength in alliances would secure a decisive outcome. But as the months passed, that confidence began to fade. The Austro-Hungarian Empire entered the war facing immediate challenges. Its military, though sizable, struggled with coordination across its diverse population. Soldiers came from various regions, speaking different languages and carrying different loyalties. What was intended to be a unified force often revealed internal divisions that complicated command and weakened effectiveness on the battlefield. Early campaigns exposed these weaknesses, battles on multiple fronts against Serbia, Russia, and later, Italy stretched the empire's resources thin. Losses mounted, and victories were often costly and temporary. The war demanded not only military strength, but also economic resilience, and the strain on both became increasingly apparent. As the conflict continued, the realities of modern warfare intensified its impact. Industrial-scale fighting brought unprecedented levels of destruction. Trenches, artillery, and prolonged engagements turned the war into a test of endurance rather than strategy alone. For the Habsburg Empire, maintaining this level of commitment proved difficult. Supplies dwindled, infrastructure suffered, and the civilian population began to feel the consequences of a war that showed no clear end. Within the empire, dissatisfaction grew. Nationalist movements, which had been contained before the war, began to re-emerge with greater intensity. Different ethnic groups questioned why they should continue to fight for a system that did not fully represent them. The sense of shared purpose that the empire relied upon began to erode, replaced by frustration and uncertainty. Leadership also faced mounting pressure. Emperor Franz Joseph I, who had ruled for decades, remained a symbol of continuity, but his ability to influence events diminished as the war progressed. When he died in 1916, he was succeeded by Charles I, a ruler who inherited not only a crown but a crisis that had already reached critical levels. Charles I recognized the severity of the situation and sought ways to bring the war to an end. He pursued peace negotiations, attempting to withdraw the empire from a conflict that was clearly unsustainable. However, these efforts were hindered by alliances and circumstances beyond his control. The empire was bound to its commitments, and the broader dynamics of the war left little room for independent resolution. By 1918, the strain had become overwhelming. Military defeats, economic collapse, and internal unrest combined to weaken the empire beyond recovery. Regions began to declare independence, breaking away from Habsburg authority. Hungary separated, followed by other territories that had once formed the core of imperial power. What had taken centuries to build began to unravel within months. The final stages of the empire's collapse were marked not by a single decisive event, but by a series of withdrawals and declarations that signaled the end of Habsburg rule. Armistices were signed, territories were lost, and the political structure that had held the empire together ceased to function. Charles I was forced into exile, bringing an end to centuries of monarchy. In the aftermath, Europe was reshaped. New nations emerged from the former territories of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, each seeking to define its own identity and future. The map that the Habsburgs had once influenced was redrawn, reflecting a shift away from dynastic rule towards national self-determination. But for the Habsburg family, the consequences were deeply personal. They were no longer rulers, but figures of a past that had been overtaken by events. Their palaces remained, their name endured, but the authority that had defined them was gone. The empire had not fallen in a single moment. It had been worn down, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hold together. Asterisk. There are moments in history that unfold so quickly, so quietly, that their true weight is only understood in hindsight. The assassination in Sarajevo was one such moment. At the time, it appeared to be a tragic but contained event, a violent act against a single figure. Yet within it lay a shift that could not be undone, a decision that would set the Habsburg Empire on a path from which there was no return. The death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand did more than remove an heir to the throne. It disrupted the fragile balance that had been holding the empire together. He had represented a possibility, however uncertain, of reform, of adapting the empire to the pressures of nationalism and change. With his death, that possibility vanished, leaving behind a leadership that was less inclined and less able to navigate the complexities ahead. In the days that followed, the response from Vienna was shaped not only by grief, but by a need to assert authority. The ultimatum issued to Serbia was crafted in such a way that acceptance seemed unlikely. It was less an invitation to resolve the crisis than a step towards confrontation. Once delivered, the outcome became increasingly predictable. What followed was not a series of isolated choices, but a chain reaction. Alliances activated, mobilizations began, and declarations of war spread across Europe with a speed that left little room for reconsideration. Each decision reinforced the next, creating a momentum that no single power could halt. What might have been contained as a regional dispute expanded into a conflict of global scale. For the Habsburg Empire, this was the moment when control was effectively lost. The decision to confront rather than contain transformed uncertainty into inevitability. War demanded resources, unity, and resilience, qualities that the empire, despite its history, struggled to sustain under such pressure. Looking back, the significance of that moment lies not only in what happened, but in what became impossible afterwards. There was no path back to stability as it had once been known. The structures that had supported the empire for centuries could not withstand the demands of a modern total war. The point of no return was not marked by a single declaration, but by the realization too late that the choices made in those early days had closed off every alternative. What remained was a future shaped not by control, but by consequence, asterisk by the final years of the war. The Habsburg Empire no longer resembled the force it had once been. What had endured for centuries was now held together by effort rather than strength, by habit rather than belief. At the center of this fragile structure stood Charles I, a ruler who inherited not an empire at its height, but one already in decline. When Charles ascended the throne in 1916, he faced a reality that few leaders would have been prepared to confront. The war had drained resources, weakened institutions, and deepened divisions within the empire. Unlike his predecessors, Charles did not see the conflict as a path to victory, but as a crisis that demanded resolution. His focus shifted from maintaining power to preserving what remained of stability. He sought peace at a time when such efforts were viewed with suspicion. Quiet negotiations were initiated. Attempts were made to reach agreements that could bring an end to the fighting. Yet, these efforts unfolded within a complex network of alliances that limited his ability to act independently. The empire was bound to its commitments, and any move towards peace risked undermining its position among its allies. Internally, the situation continued to deteriorate. Nationalist movements grew stronger, no longer willing to accept compromise. The idea of a unified empire had begun to lose its meaning for many of its people. What had once been seen as a source of protection and identity was now viewed as an obstacle to self-determination. Charles recognized these changes, but his options were limited. Reforms introduced too late could not reverse decades of tension. The structure of the empire, built on hierarchy and tradition, was no longer capable of adapting to the demands of a rapidly changing world. Each attempt to stabilize this situation revealed how little control remained. The final months of the empire were marked not by decisive battles, but by quiet withdrawals and shifting loyalties. Authority faded gradually, replaced by new centers of power emerging within former territories. What had once required force to challenge now dissolved with minimal resistance. For Charles, the end came not with a formal defeat, but with the recognition that the empire could no longer function. In 1918, he relinquished participation in state affairs, effectively stepping away from a system that had defined his family for generations. Exile followed, and with it, the end of Habsburg rule. In these final moments, the struggle was no longer about victory. It was about understanding that some battles cannot be won, only endured. Asterisk. Long after the fall of the Habsburg Empire, its presence continues to linger not through political power, but through the monuments and symbols that once defined its authority. Among this, Schönbrunn Palace stands as one of the most enduring reminders of a dynasty that shaped the course of European history. Its vast gardens, grand halls, and carefully designed interiors reflect a world where power was not only exercised, but displayed with precision and intention. Originally constructed as a hunting lodge in the 17th century and later expanded into a full imperial residence, Schönbrunn became more than a home. It was a stage upon which the identity of the Habsburgs was carefully presented. Every room, every corridor, and every detail was designed to communicate stability, order, and continuity. It was here that rulers governed, decisions were made, and traditions were reinforced through ceremony and ritual. Within these walls, generations of the Habsburg family lived lives shaped by expectation. The palace was not simply a place of comfort, but a structure that defined behavior and reinforced hierarchy. Formality governed daily life, and even private moments were influenced by the weight of imperial responsibility. It was a setting where identity was closely tied to role, and where deviation from expectation was rarely permitted beyond Schönbrunn. The legacy of the Habsburgs is embedded throughout Vienna. The city itself became a reflection of their influence, shaped by architecture, culture, and institutions that continued to define its character. The Habsburg Palace, once the center of political power, stands alongside grand avenues in public, buildings that were designed to express imperial strength together. These structures form a landscape that preserves the memory of a dynasty long after its rule has ended. Cultural contributions further extend this legacy. Vienna became a center for music, art, and intellectual life during the height of Habsburg influence. Composers such as Mozart and later Strauss flourished within an environment supported by imperial patronage. Their work, though independent in its creativity, was made possible by a system that valued cultural expression as part of its identity. Even after the empire's collapse, this cultural heritage remained, continuing to shape how Vienna is experienced and understood. Yet these monuments and achievements present only part of the story. They reflect how the Habsburgs wished to be seen powerful, refined, and enduring. What they do not fully reveal is the complexity that existed behind these carefully constructed images. The grandeur of Schönbrunn and the elegance of Vienna's cultural life often stood in contrast to the internal pressures faced by the dynasty. Over time, these symbols have taken on new meaning. No longer tied to active rule, they exist as reminders of a past that is both admired and questioned. Visitors walk through Schönbrunn, not as subjects, but as observers, interpreting its significance through the lens of history. The palace remains unchanged in its structure, yet its purpose has shifted from a center of authority to a site of reflection. In this way, the legacy of the Habsburgs endures not through control, but through memory. Their monuments continue to stand, their cultural contributions continue to resonate, and their influence remains visible in the spaces they shaped. However, these enduring symbols also invite a deeper consideration of what they represent, not just power and achievement, but the complexities and contradictions that accompanied them. What remains is not the empire itself, but the imprinted, left behind an image of greatness preserved in stone, even as the reality that created it has long since disappeared. By the time the First World War came to an end in 1918, the Habsburg Empire had already begun to dissolve from within. What followed was not a dramatic final collapse, but a gradual and undeniable fragmentation, as regions that had once been held together by imperial authority moved towards independence. The structure that had defined Central Europe for centuries no longer had the strength to sustain itself. As military defeat became unavoidable, the political foundations of the empire weakened rapidly. National councils formed across various territories, each seeking to assert control over its own future. Czechoslovakia declared independence, followed by the emergence of a separate Hungarian state. In the Balkans, new arrangements took shape, as regions distanced themselves from Habsburg rule. These developments were not isolated. They reflected a broader shift towards national identity that the empire could no longer contain. Within Austria itself, the transition was equally significant. The imperial system, once centered on the authority of the Habsburg dynasty, was replaced by a republican form of government. What had been an empire became a much smaller state, its influence confined to a fraction of its former reach. Vienna, once the heart of a vast political network, now stood as the capital of a reduced nation. For the Habsburg family, this transformation marked the end of their role as rulers. Charles I, the last emperor, withdrew from active participation in governance, effectively bringing centuries of monarchy to a close. Although he never formally abdicated, his departure from power signaled that the system he represented could no longer function. Exile followed, separating the family from the lands they had governed for generations. The consequences of this decline extended beyond political boundaries. The identity of the empire built over centuries through alliances, traditions, and shared structures was replaced by new national frameworks. Languages, cultures, and histories that had coexisted under Habsburg rule began to redefine themselves independently. This process created opportunities for self-determination, but it also introduced new challenges. As emerging states navigated their place in a changing Europe, economically and socially, the transition was equally complex. Systems that had once operated within a unified imperial framework had to be reorganized. Trade routes shifted, administrative structures were rebuilt, and populations adjusted to new forms of governance. The continuity that had characterized Habsburg rule was replaced by uncertainty, as each new state established its own direction. Despite the scale of these changes, the decline of the Habsburg Empire was not entirely unexpected depressors. That led to its collapse. Nationalism, modernization, and the demands of a global conflict had been building for decades. What the war did was accelerate a process that was already underway, bringing it to a conclusion that could no longer be delayed. In the end, the Habsburgs did not lose their empire in a single decisive moment. It slipped away through a series of shifts that reflected a world moving beyond the structures they had relied upon. Their authority, once unquestioned, became incompatible with the realities of a new era. What remained was a legacy shaped not only by what they had built, but by how it ultimately came to an end. The story of the Habsburg Empire is not simply one of power gained and power lost. It is a reflection of how ambition, strategy, and tradition can shape the course of history, while also carrying consequences that are not always immediately visible. For centuries, the Habsburgs built their influence through patience, alliances, and an ability to adapt just enough to remain in control. They created a system that connected vast regions, cultures, and identities under a single imperial vision. Yet that same system required constant maintenance. It depended on balance between authority and compromise, unity and diversity, tradition and change. Over time, this balance became increasingly difficult to sustain. The structures that once ensured stability began to resist adaptation, and the methods that had secured success no longer aligned with the realities of a changing world. What the Habsburgs gained was extraordinary. They shaped Europe's political landscape, influenced its culture, and left behind monuments that continue to define cities like Vienna. Their legacy is visible in architecture, in music, and in the historical memory of a continent that was once closely tied to their rule. But what they lost was equally significant. The unity they built could not endure the pressures of nationalism and modern conflict. The identity that had defined their empire fragmented, replaced by new nations seeking their own paths. And for the family itself, power gave way to exile, authority to memory. In the end, the Habsburg Empire stands as a reminder that history's greatest achievements often carry unseen costs. What is built over centuries can be undone in a fraction of that time, not always through sudden collapse, but through gradual change that becomes impossible to resist. They gained a world shaped in their image, but in trying to hold it together, they lost the very foundation that made it possible.